Hello and welcome back to the Genealogy radio show, the radio show that is keeping you in the loop. The show airs out from Radio Corca Bastion in beautiful Kilkee and is repeated on Sunday at 4. And this week our show is all about St Brigid's Day. Now Chloe, could you tell us exactly about who St Brigid was?
Certainly. So St. Brigid, or she's sometimes known as St. Brigid of Kildare, is one of our patron saints here in Ireland alongside St. Patrick and St. Columba. Brigid is sometimes known also as Mura na Gael or Mary of the Gale, which also means Our Lady of the Irish. Brigid shares her name with the Celtic pagan goddess of fire, Brigid. Now, our Brigid, St. Brigid of Kildare, was born to Dovthach, a pagan chieftain of Leinster, and Baraka, a Christian slave brought to Ireland by pirates in Foghart near Dundor, County Louth, around 450 BC. For 2 centuries following the fall of Roman Empire in regards to slaves, Irish pirates would sail to Roman Britain, which had been destabilized by the fall of the Roman Empire, would raid the country and kidnap people back to Ireland, where they would later become slaves, which destabilized the Britain population at the time. Children born of slaves would contribute to the Irish slave population at the time, and under Brennan law, they were considered dair fritir, which is servile inferior, which is the closest class we have to slaves, as they do not belong to a certain clan, but they could eventually become a free person again by moving up the ranks of society. When she found out Baraka was pregnant, Dovthach's wife actually forced him to sell Baraka to a druid. And after Brigid was born, it was believed a white cow with red ears could sustain her, as Brigid would vomit any food the druid would feed her, as he was considered impure. Now, Brigid's miracle work actually began in her childhood when she would help heal and feed the poor. At one point, Brigid sold all of her mother's stores of butter in an act of generosity. And fearing that she would get into trouble, she prayed to God, and eventually the butter was replenished. When Brigid was 10 years old, she returned to her father's household without her mother, and she would be kept as his servant. During her time as a father's servant, Brigid would cause her father grief by giving away his valuable possessions to the poor and needy. Eventually, her father became so frustrated with her generous behavior, he decided to sell Brigid to the King of Leinster. However, when her father was negotiating a deal with the king, Brigid managed to give away her father's valuable sword to a beggar who wanted it for food. When the king learned of what she's done, he decided that she may be a nuisance to his household, but also admiring her courage and persistence and recognizing her holiness, he granted Brigid her freedom. After being freed, Brigid dedicated her life to God and entered a convent in Cornhill in County Meath. Afterwards, Brigid would travel across the country, finding convents and performing miracles, while organizing a communal consecrated religious life for women in Ireland with 7 of her friends. Brigid founded her most famous monastery in Kildare on the site of a pagan shrine to the Celtic goddess she was named after, and where a group of young women were tending an eternal flame beside an oak tree where the town of Kinsale now stands today. St. Brigid also found a double monastery in Kildare, one for men and one for women, and had asked a hermit named Conleth to be the spiritual pastor of the monastery. Now, Brigid was believed to have died February 1st, the day we celebrated her feast day, around the year 524. She was buried in Kildare Cathedral until 878, when she was exhumed and buried in Downpatrick alongside her fellow patron saints, Patrick and Columba. The relics of the 3 saints were later discovered in 1185, and the next year their remains would be transferred and reburied in Down Cathedral. Now, here's the fun stuff. Her skull was actually removed from the rest of her body, and in 1283, 3 Irish knights brought her skull to Portugal, where it remains in the Igreja São João Bastia, or in English, the Church of St. John the Baptist, in Lumiar, in one of Lisbon's parishes. In 1929, the Cardinal of Lisbon actually gifted a small portion of the skull back to Ireland, and it was placed in St. Brigid's Church in Killarney, County Dublin. Funny enough, in 2000, 12, the reliquary that stored the skull was actually stolen in 2012 prior to St. Brigid's Day. But luckily enough, the skull wasn't actually in it, as the reliquary was undergoing renovations at the time.
Thank you, Chloe. Now, Jack, could you divulge more into the Celtic origins of St. Brigid's Day?
Yes, certainly. So St. Brigid's Day was originally a Celtic pagan holiday called Imbolc. Imbolc was a celebration of the end of winter and the start of spring. More specifically, it was to celebrate the halfway point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. Imbolc was one of the major Celtic holidays alongside Bellatine, the holiday celebrating the beginning of summer, Lugnasa, the Celtic holiday that celebrated the beginning of the harvest season, and Samhain, the Celtic holiday celebrating the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter. So the word Imbolc means in the belly of the mother, which represents two things. One, it represents practically the birth of new animals, specifically sheep. And the second, spiritually, is that it's the beginning of spring, and it's just in general growth, like that Mother Earth is, the seed of spring is in the Mother Earth. So Imbolc also celebrates the Celtic goddess Brigid, the Celtic goddess of fire and fertility. Her name means exalted one, and she was the daughter of Dagda, who was the supreme god, and she's also one of the Tuatha de Danann, who's a tribe of gods. Basically, it's the pantheon of Irish pre-Christian gods. So the earliest mention of Imbolc in Irish literature dates back to the 10th century. And this is creates the alternative of where it's like, if St. Brigid, the Christian one, is supposed to be of the 5th century, it's like, and the earliest mention is in the 10th century, it's like, does St. Brigid predate Brigid, the Celtic goddess? And so an alternative of who may have been celebrated during this is, it might have been Danu, the mother of gods, and who would have been the grandmother of Brigid. Anyway, I'll pass it on to you.
Eve, could you give us more of an insight to some of the traditions associated with St. Brigid's Day?
Absolutely. So there are many traditions associated with St. Brigid's Day, especially in Ireland. Back when it was first being celebrated, regardless of the household's financial position, the woman of the house would use the eve of St. Brigid's Day to make a big feast to celebrate the holiday. This feast would consist of things like apple cake, dumplings, and definitely colcannon. As well as this, the woman of the house would ensure that the house was respectable and tidy, kind of in preparation for a visit from the saint. As well as this, all farmers' wives gathered together for a boring brack, and neighbours were encouraged to join in the drinking and the celebration. The saint was said to roam around the countryside on St. Brigid's Eve, showering blessings on the people and the livestock. So a couple of aspects were used to convey that her visit to these houses was welcomed. Many people would place a cake or slices of bread and butter on the windowsill outside. This contribution was often left for a tramp or an underprivileged person to collect. It was carried in the next morning in other places and split among the household members. As well as this, a sheaf of corn was often placed next to the cake as a source of nutrition for the saint's favourite cow who followed her. There are a lot of St. Brigid's Day rituals that have largely faded away, but are ready for rebirth. So the Biddy Boy Parade took place in several parts of Ireland on St. Brigid's Day. The Biddy Boys would travel from home to home, dressed in straw costumes and playing music, collecting food or money in return. Now, the people of Ireland were really of a superstitious nature at this time, and refusing these Biddy Boys a donation was deemed unlucky. So most people would partake. They also carried a bridge oak, a little straw doll around with them, which was dressed in white and served as an effigy of the saint.
Thank you, Eve. Now, the St. Brigid's Cross is one of the archetypal symbols of Ireland. While it is considered a Christian symbol, it has roots in the pre-Christian goddess Brigid also. On the eve of her feast day, people thought St. Brigid walked the land, blessing and protecting homes and fields where crosses were placed in her honour. Now, throughout Ireland, there were several regional styles and variants, as well as diverse materials employed. It was usually made from rushes and comprised a woven square in the centre and four radials tied at the ends. Families would pray, bless the rushes or straw with holy water, and then build the crosses individually. To welcome St. Brigid, they would hang them over the door and throughout the house. Many houses preserve the cross in the under thatch of the house each year, and the number of crosses in the roof might tell you how old a house or how long the family had lived there. The leftovers from the cross were not thrown away, but rather placed on the floor near the hearth, typically covered with a white cloth to create a bed for the saint. The straw left over from Brigid's bed and the building of the crosses was thought to have healing properties in other regions. At night, strands were saved and wound around aching head or limbs. In Christian mythology, Saint Brigid and her cross are linked together by a story about her weaving this form of cross at the deathbed of a pagan chieftain who, upon hearing what the cross meant, asked to be baptized. Even today, a St. Brigid's cross can be found in many homes in Ireland, especially in rural areas. Now, Eve, could you tell us more about the folklore behind St. Brigid's Day?
Yes, so my first memories personally of St. Brigid's Day was when we were taught about it in school. And the way we were taught in school was often through folklore. So there are many stories about St. Brigid, but none of them are as well known as the one about St. Brigid's Cloak. So at this time, the King of Leinster had an awful secret. He basically had massive ears like a donkey. And when he heard of St. Brigid's amazing miracles, he invited her to his palace to see what she could do. So Brigid consented and agreed to assist, but in exchange, she wanted a little bit of land for her troubles. But the king at the time was very protective of his territory and he didn't want his kingdom to be divided. But Brigid just requested a small piece of land that only her cloak could cover. So the king was only delighted and agreed to the deal because how much land could a cloak cover? After this, Brigid dropped on her knees in prayer and the King of Leinster fell into a deep sleep. But when he woke, he had the most magnificent ears any man in Ireland had ever seen. He was completely content, and Brigid returned home with the date arranged for the king's visit to her Kildare church. So the King of Leinster and his men met Brigid and her nuns in the outskirts of Kildare on the designated day. The king summoned Brigid to cast out her cloak at the allotted time. This she did, and the garment stretched and spread until it covered the territory we now know as St. Brigid's pastures, the Curragh of Kildare. The king was so displeased that Brigid had outwitted him, but he upheld his end of the deal and returned home. Now, another version of this narrative claims that St. Brigid and her nuns wove and sewed for weeks, joining all their cloaks together, and then rolled out this massive new cloak over the Curragh at the specific moment, which is how St. Brigid obtained the land. But many also believe that her religious power and her power from God allowed her to take this land from the king. So that's the folklore that I would associate with St. Brigid.
Victor, could you explain to us why St. Brigid's Day is so popular?
Of course. So St. Brigid, along with St. Patrick, is a name that has become synonymous with Ireland for years, and she's still an immensely popular saint. So popular, in fact, that just this year, St. Brigid's Day was announced to become a permanent holiday in Ireland from next year, 2023. It'll be on par with the likes of one of the biggest days in the Irish calendar, which was St. Patrick's Day. Ireland, which is known as the land of saints and scholars, has many saints, over 300 to be associated with the island. So what is it that makes St. Brigid stand out from all the others? So there are many reasons why she is well liked. Perhaps it's because one of her reported miracles is turning water into beer. She is also the patron saint of cattle owners, and Ireland is of course massive in agriculture. And scholars, whom are large in number in Ireland also, so much that Ireland is the island of scholars. And she's also the patron saint of spring, which is a very important time agriculturally, another reason for farmers to worship her, as it is the time when the majority of newborn farm animals are born. in the spring season. She can be worshipped for many different reasons, thus making her a very versatile saint, so to say. She is also the goddess of fertility, making her a major goddess for those wanting a child in Ireland. She is one of the few gods whose popularity was so big that when Christianity became the main religion in Ireland, she stayed popular even with the dwindling of the pagan religion. Much of Brigid's miracles are done through acts of kindness and generosity, and through this gives a great association with the name Brigid and goodness, thus making her a very popular saint and saint name. She chose to dedicate her life to God and doing good works and set up her own place of worship, and as such was a very independent woman who could not be bullied and was not a pushover. Now, this was hundreds and hundreds of years ago when the idea of independent females wasn't even considered, and mostly everything was done and decided upon by men. One quote described her as being very hard to buy and even harder to sell, referring to the fact that her father tried to sell her and that she was a slave. Brigid was one of the most popular baby names in Ireland for decades. It has since moved on to more modern names, like, for instance, Emily, which has been the most popular baby name in Ireland for the last 10 years. But there are still those sentimental enough to name their children after the patron saint. For example, my own parents who named my sister Brigid. So I can safely assume that the name Brigid is more popular with traditional Irish families. But yeah, speaking on names, Brigid and also Patrick are names that are linked to Irish people all over the world. These names were shortened in a way that actually offended Irish people or stereotyped them. So Irish people, especially in America, would be called Paddies and Biddies, and these names were used when speaking on any Irish, regardless of their name. This is even evident in modern times. So, for example, the vehicle in which anyone is arrested in is known as a paddy wagon, and this is because of the fact that this vehicle was linked with the idea that most of the time it was rounding up the drunken Irish or the drunken quote-unquote paddies. So back to the point at hand, Biddy was the female variant of Paddy, and as such is not really a name you hear that much anymore. These names have been immortalized in Dominic Behan's poems. I'll just read it out here so you get an idea. The crack was good in Cricklewood, and they wouldn't leave the crown, with glasses flying and biddies crying, because Paddy was going to town. So this little poem just gives insight into how popular these names were and how just hearing them could associate the Irish with them. So yeah, I hope that's enough to give you a little insight into why Brigid was so popular.
Thank you, Victor. And we'll hand over to Lorna now to bring us out for the day. We hope you enjoyed our show.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful show today. And thank you for listening to the show that's keeping you in the loop, the Genealogy radio show. We've got some exciting things planned for March, and we're going to be looking at films and family histories and how they integrate, and also the Cummings project, which is based in County Laois. So we were delighted to celebrate St Brigid's today, and thank you for being part of the show that's keeping you in the loop.